Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise? Or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm, historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. But first, let me give you an example of just how brutal these men could be. So you understand, we're not talking about ordinary medieval violence here. When Eric Bloodaxe earned his nickname, it wasn't through some heroic battle or noble conquest. No, he literally murdered every single one of his brothers to secure his throne, methodically hunting them down one by one like animals. And that was considered normal behavior for him. The thing is, when most people think of terrible rulers throughout history, they picture Roman emperors or medieval tyrants from Central Europe. But the Vikings produced some of the most systematically cruel leaders the world has ever seen. Men who combined the tactical brilliance of great military minds with the sadistic creativity of complete psychopaths. What makes their stories even more chilling is that these weren't random acts of violence born from madness, but calculated campaigns of terror designed to break the spirits of entire populations. So let's dive into the blood-soaked world of Viking brutality, starting with the man who literally earned his crown by wading through the blood of his own family. Eric Bloodaxe stands as perhaps the most ruthlessly efficient fratricide in Viking history. Born around 885 as one of King Harold Fair's many sons, Eric understood from an early age that having too many brothers was a dangerous luxury he couldn't afford. While most royal siblings engaged in political maneuvering or formed alliances to secure their positions, Eric chose a more direct approach. He systematically murdered every single one of his brothers, earning his infamous nickname through what can only be described as a methodical family massacre. The sources describe Eric's campaign against his brothers as coldly calculated rather than driven by rage or passion. He would invite them to feasts under the pretense of reconciliation, only to have them poisoned or stabbed by hidden assassins. Other brothers he hunted down like wild game, tracking them across Norway's fjords and forests until he could corner them in isolated locations where their screams wouldn't carry to potential allies. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the killing itself, but the patience Eric displayed, sometimes waiting years for the perfect opportunity to eliminate a particular brother. What made Eric's fratricide even more terrifying was his ability to maintain political relationships throughout the carnage. While he was butchering his siblings, he continued to function as a respected leader, making alliances, commanding raids, and presenting himself as a legitimate heir to his father's throne. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming and intelligent in his public dealings, capable of discussing poetry and politics with equal skill, all while privately orchestrating the deaths of his own blood relatives. His wife, Gunhild, became his perfect partner in these schemes. Known as Gunhild, Mother of Kings, she possessed a reputation for sorcery and political manipulation that complemented Eric's more direct methods perfectly. Together they created what medieval sources describe as a reign of terror that extended far beyond their family disputes. Gunhild would identify threats through her network of spies and informants, while Eric would eliminate them with brutal efficiency. The psychological impact of Eric's actions extended throughout Norwegian society. Noble families began to fear their own relatives, never knowing if a brother or cousin might be plotting their demise. The very concept of family loyalty, so crucial to Viking culture, became poisoned by Eric's example. Parents started viewing multiple sons not as blessings but as potential sources of future bloodshed, fundamentally altering how Viking families approached succession and inheritance. But Eric's appetite for violence wasn't satisfied by domestic slaughter alone. Once he had secured his position in Norway, he turned his attention to expanding his reign of terror across the North Sea. His raids on England and Scotland became legendary for their systematic cruelty. Unlike other Viking leaders who raided for wealth or territory, Eric seemed to raid for the pure pleasure of causing suffering. Contemporary English chronicles describe Eric's forces as behaving differently from typical Viking raiders, where most Vikings would demand ransom for captured nobles or negotiate tribute arrangements with local rulers. Eric's men were instructed to maximize psychological damage. They would capture entire families and force parents to watch their children being tortured before killing them all. They burned monasteries not just to eliminate resistance, but to specifically target the religious and cultural foundations of their enemies' societies. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Eric's presence in English waters could be detected not by seeing his ships, but by following the smoke from burning villages and the streams of refugees fleeing inland. His reputation became so terrifying that some English coastal settlements would evacuate entirely upon receiving reports that Eric's fleet had been spotted days away, preferring to abandon their homes rather than risk encountering his forces. What distinguished Eric from other brutal Viking leaders was his understanding of terror as a strategic weapon. He recognized that reputation could be more powerful than actual military force, and he cultivated his fearsome image with the same attention to detail that other leaders devoted to their battle tactics. Every act of cruelty was calculated to spread stories that would weaken his enemy's resolve before he even arrived to fight them. Moving from familial murder to religious persecution, we encounter Ivar the Boneless, a warlord whose very name became synonymous with the systematic destruction of Christian England, part of the legendary Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865. Ivar brought a level of calculated brutality to warfare that shocked even his Viking contemporaries. His nickname remains a subject of debate among historians, with some suggesting it referred to a physical condition while others argue it described his serpentine cunning or his ability to slip through enemy defenses like a creature without bones. What isn't debatable is the trail of destruction Ivar left across England. Unlike raiders who struck quickly and retreated, Ivar understood the power of psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. His forces didn't just conquer territories. They systematically dismantled the cultural and religious infrastructure that held Anglo-Saxon society together. Churches weren't simply looted, but completely destroyed. Their stones scattered and their foundations salted to prevent rebuilding. Priests and monks weren't just killed, but tortured in ways specifically designed to break the faith of surviving witnesses. The most notorious example of Ivar's calculated cruelty was his treatment of King Edmund of East Anglia, when Edmund refused to renounce Christianity and become Ivar's vassal. Ivar didn't simply execute him as most conquerors would. Instead, he subjected Edmund to the blood eagle, one of the most horrifying execution methods in Viking tradition. The victim's ribs would be cut away from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, while the lungs were pulled out and spread across the ribs. Edmund was kept alive throughout this process, forced to experience every moment of agony while Ivar's men chanted pagan prayers. But Ivar's genius for terror extended beyond individual executions. He understood that destroying symbols could be more effective than destroying armies. His forces specifically targeted religious artifacts, royal regalia, and cultural treasures, not for their material value, but for their psychological impact. When they captured York, Ivar ordered his men to use altar stones from the cathedral as foundations for latrines, forcing the surviving population to witness their most sacred objects being literally defiled every day. The systematic nature of Ivar's campaigns reveals a mind that understood warfare on multiple levels. While his brothers Han and Uber focused on traditional conquest and plunder, Ivar was conducting what we might recognize today as psychological warfare. He studied his enemies' beliefs and customs, not out of curiosity, but to identify the most effective ways to break their spirits. Every act of sacrilege was carefully chosen to maximize despair among the surviving population. Contemporary sources describe how Evar's reputation preceded his armies like a plague. Towns would surrender without resistance upon hearing that the boneless was approaching, preferring slavery to the alternative of experiencing his creative brutality. This psychological dominance allowed Ivar to conquer vast territories with relatively small forces, as his reputation did much of the work that would otherwise require massive armies. His treatment of captured nobles became the stuff of nightmares throughout Anglo-Saxon England, rather than demanding ransoms or negotiating political arrangements. Ivar would keep high-ranking prisoners alive for extended periods, subjecting them to public humiliations and tortures designed to break their followers' loyalty. He understood that destroying a leader's dignity could be more effective than simply killing them, as it demonstrated to their people that their traditional sources of protection and authority were powerless against Viking might. The long-term impact of Ivar's methods extended far beyond the immediate military campaigns. His systematic destruction of religious and cultural institutions created a trauma that persisted in English collective memory for generations. The very name Evar became a byword for diabolic cruelty used by parents to frighten disobedient children and by priests to illustrate the reality of earthly evil. What made Evar particularly terrifying was his apparent enjoyment of the psychological aspects of conquest. Unlike leaders who viewed brutality as a necessary evil or a means to an end, contemporary accounts suggest that Evar took genuine pleasure in devising new ways to break his enemy's spirits. He would spend hours planning elaborate tortures and humiliations, approaching cruelty with the same creativity that other leaders brought to poetry or craftsmanship. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ivar's legacy was how his methods influenced other Viking leaders. His success in using terror as a strategic weapon inspired imitators throughout the Viking world, creating a generation of warlords who competed to devise ever more horrifying ways to intimidate their enemies. The techniques he pioneered in England would spread throughout Viking territories, fundamentally changing how Norse leaders approached conquest and occupation. From the blood-soaked battlefields of England, our journey into Viking brutality takes us north to the frozen wastes of Norway, where we encounter Olaf Tryggvason, a man whose conversion to Christianity somehow made him even more terrifyingly violent than his pagan predecessors. This wasn't the gentle conversion of a reformed sinner, finding peace through faith. No, Olaf wielded Christianity like a blood-stained battle axe, using his newfound religion as justification for levels of cruelty that would have impressed even Eric Bloodaxe himself. What makes Olaf's story particularly disturbing is how he transformed religious conversion from a personal spiritual journey into a weapon of mass torture. When he decided that Norway should become Christian, he didn't send missionaries or build churches. Instead, he traveled from village to village with a simple ultimatum: convert immediately or experience agonies that would make you beg for the mercy of a quick death. And Olaf was a man of his word when it came to delivering on threats. The sagas describe his conversion methods with a level of detail that suggests contemporary witnesses were both horrified and fascinated by his techniques. When he encountered resistance from traditional Norse believers, Olaf would select the most prominent pagan leaders and subject them to tortures specifically designed to break not just their bodies, but their spirits. He understood that forcing someone to renounce their ancestral gods required destroying their fundamental sense of identity, and he approached this psychological dismantling with the precision of a master craftsman. One of his most notorious techniques involved what the sources call the hot iron persuasion. Pagan priests and stubborn chieftains would be stripped naked and bound to wooden posts while red-hot iron implements were applied to various parts of their bodies. But this wasn't random torture born from rage. Olaf would start with non-vital areas carefully, escalating the pain while repeatedly offering the option of conversion. The psychological pressure was immense, because the victim knew that accepting Christianity would end their immediate suffering, but they also knew that Renouncing their gods would destroy their standing in the community and their prospects in the afterlife. What distinguished Olaf from other brutal rulers was his ability to present his cruelty as moral righteousness. He genuinely believed that torturing pagans into conversion was saving their souls, which gave him a level of conviction that made his methods even more terrifying. Unlike leaders who might show mercy when their anger cooled, or their political objectives were met, Olaf's religious fervor meant that compromise was impossible. You either converted or you suffered until you died or lost your mind, and he saw both outcomes as divinely ordained. His treatment of entire communities reveals the systematic nature of his approach to forced conversion. When Olaf arrived at a settlement, he would immediately identify the religious and political leaders, understanding that breaking these individuals would cause the entire social structure to collapse. He would force the population to gather and watch as their leaders were tortured, creating a collective trauma that made resistance psychologically impossible for most people. The sources describe how Olaf would use family relationships as leverage in his conversion campaigns. Parents would be forced to watch their children being tortured, while children would be made to witness their parents' agonies. But the true genius of his cruelty was offering each family member the power to end their loved one's suffering by converting to Christianity themselves. This created impossible moral dilemmas that destroyed traditional family bonds and community solidarity, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable to his religious message. Contemporary accounts suggest that Olaf took genuine pleasure in the theological debates he would conduct while torturing his victims. He would quote Christian scripture while applying hot irons to pagan priests, creating a horrifying juxtaposition between messages of divine love and immediate physical agony. This wasn't mere sadism, but a calculated attempt to associate Christian doctrine with overwhelming power and authority, making conversion seem like the only rational choice for survival. But Olaf's conversion methods extended beyond physical torture to include psychological warfare that was equally devastating. He understood that Norse culture was built around concepts of honor, loyalty, and ancestral connection, so he specifically targeted these cultural foundations. Pagan leaders who converted under torture were forced to publicly renounce not just their gods but their ancestors, their cultural traditions, and their personal honor. This cultural destruction was often more devastating than the physical pain, as it left converts completely isolated from their traditional sources of identity and meaning. The long-term effects of Olaf's conversion campaigns created a Norway where Christianity was associated not with love and redemption, but with terror and submission. Entire generations grew up understanding that religious belief was something imposed through violence rather than chosen through spiritual conviction. This created a peculiar form of Norwegian Christianity that retained much of the violence and fatalism of Norse paganism while adding Christian theological justification for brutality. What makes Olaf's story even more chilling is how he influenced other rulers throughout Scandinavia. His success in using torture as a conversion tool inspired Christian kings in Denmark and Sweden to adopt similar methods, creating a wave of religious violence that swept across the entire region. The techniques he pioneered for breaking cultural resistance became standard practices for rulers seeking to impose religious or political changes on reluctant populations. Moving from religious persecution to political paranoia, we encounter Magnus the Cruel, a Danish king whose reign became a masterclass in how suspicion and fear could transform a competent ruler into a monster who destroyed everything he touched. Magnus didn't start his reign as a particularly brutal man, but his growing paranoia about potential threats gradually transformed him into someone who saw enemies in every shadow and betrayal in every conversation. What made Magnus particularly dangerous was his intelligence combined with his increasing inability to trust anyone around him. Unlike rulers whose cruelty stemmed from ignorance or simple sadism, Magnus was smart enough to devise sophisticated systems for identifying and eliminating potential threats. Unfortunately, his definition of what constituted a threat expanded continuously throughout his reign, eventually encompassing virtually everyone who held any position of authority or influence in his kingdom. The early signs of Magnus' transformation into a monster were subtle but ominous. He began requiring increasingly elaborate loyalty oaths from his nobles, not just simple pledges of allegiance but detailed promises that included clauses about reporting suspicious conversations and surrendering family members as hostages, if necessary. What started as reasonable precautions against rebellion gradually evolved into a comprehensive surveillance system that turned every member of the Danish nobility into both a potential suspect and an unwilling informant. His treatment of suspected conspirators reveals the methodical nature of his paranoia. Rather than simply executing people he suspected of disloyalty, Magnus would orchestrate elaborate investigations designed to extract confessions and identify co-conspirators. These investigations invariably involved torture, but Magnus' tortures were specifically designed to produce detailed information rather than simply cause pain. He understood that breaking someone's will to resist required different techniques than breaking their body, and he became an expert at both. The psychological pressure Magnus created throughout his kingdom was perhaps more devastating than his physical cruelty. Nobles never knew when an innocent conversation might be misinterpreted as treasonous, when a business transaction might be seen as a conspiracy, or when a family gathering might be viewed as a plotting session. This constant anxiety created a society where everyone was afraid to speak freely, to form genuine relationships, or to take any actions that might be construed as suspicious by the increasingly paranoid king. What distinguished Magnus from other paranoid rulers was his ability to create self-fulfilling prophecies of betrayal. His excessive suspicion and brutal responses to perceived threats created genuine resentment among his nobles, which he then interpreted as evidence that his paranoia was justified. This created a vicious cycle where his cruelty generated actual conspiracies which justified even more extreme measures, which generated more resentment and more real conspiracies. Contemporary sources describe how Magnus would test the loyalty of his supporters by spreading false information to see who would report it back to him and who might use it for their own purposes. These loyalty tests became increasingly elaborate and dangerous, often requiring nobles to betray friends or family members to prove their dedication to the crown. The psychological damage these tests inflicted on Danish society was immense, as they systematically destroyed the trust and personal relationships that held communities together. His execution methods became legendary for their creative cruelty, but what made them particularly horrifying was how Magnus would use them as public education tools. When he executed suspected traitors, he would force the entire court to attend and would provide detailed explanations of why each particular torture was being applied. These weren't just executions, but teaching moments designed to show everyone exactly what would happen to them if they were suspected of disloyalty. The final years of Magnus' reign saw him descending into a level of paranoia that bordered on complete madness. He began to suspect his own family members, his personal servants, even his food tasters and bodyguards. The palace became a place where everyone lived in constant terror, never knowing if their next interaction with the king might be their last. This atmosphere of fear eventually became so pervasive that it paralyzed the entire governmental system, as officials became too frightened to make any decisions that might somehow offend or threaten the increasingly unstable monarch. But the most chilling aspect of Magnus' reign was how his paranoia became infectious, spreading throughout Danish society like a plague. Nobles began to suspect each other. Communities turned against their leaders, and families became fractured by mutual suspicion and betrayal. The social fabric that held Denmark together began to unravel as Magnus' psychological instability created a kingdom where trust became impossible and fear became the only reliable constant. The systematic destruction of trust that Magnus accomplished reveals something truly terrifying about human nature: how quickly civilization can collapse when fear becomes the primary governing principle. But even Magnus' paranoid reign pales in comparison to the calculated sadism of our next warlord, a man who turned the act of dying into an elaborate theatrical performance designed to break the minds of everyone forced to witness. Sigurd Snake in the Eye earned his nickname not through any physical deformity, but because of his ability to strike with the sudden, venomous precision of a serpent. What made Sigurd particularly dangerous wasn't just his tactical brilliance or his skill in battle, but his understanding that true power came from controlling how people died rather than simply killing them efficiently. He transformed execution from a swift administrative necessity into a prolonged artistic endeavor that could last for days or even weeks. The sources describe Sigurd's approach to torture as almost scholarly in its thoroughness. He would study his victims carefully before beginning their torment, learning about their fears, their relationships, their deepest sources of shame and pride. This wasn't casual cruelty, but a systematic process of psychological archaeology, digging into a person's soul to find the most effective ways to destroy their spirit before finally allowing their body to follow. His most notorious innovation was what contemporary chroniclers called the living death. Victims would be kept in a state where they were technically alive but experiencing such constant agony that they would beg for the mercy of actual death. Sigurd understood that the threat of prolonged suffering could be more effective than immediate execution in breaking the will of potential enemies. Word would spread throughout his territories about prisoners who had been kept in states of living torment for months, creating a psychological weapon that was far more powerful than any physical army. What distinguished Sigurd from other cruel rulers was his patience. While men like Eric Bloodaxe killed in fits of rage or strategic necessity, Sigurd approached torture as a craft that required time and careful attention to detail. He would spend weeks planning the perfect sequence of torments for important prisoners, consulting with experts in anatomy and medicine to ensure that his victims could survive the maximum amount of suffering before finally succumbing. His treatment of captured enemy leaders became the stuff of nightmares throughout Scandinavia, rather than executing them quickly to prevent rescue attempts or political complications. Sigurd would keep them alive in public cages where their subjects could witness their degradation. These weren't simple imprisonments, but carefully orchestrated displays of powerlessness, designed to show entire populations that their traditional sources of protection and authority were utterly helpless. Against his will, the psychological impact of these public tortures extended far beyond their immediate victims. Parents would use stories of Sigurd's cages to terrify disobedient children, while warriors would lose their courage. At the mere mention of his name, the knowledge that capture by Sigurd meant something far worse than death created a level of fear that made conventional military resistance almost impossible in many regions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sigurd's methods was how he would involve the victims' families and followers in their torment. Captured nobles would be forced to watch their children being tortured while their subjects would be given the choice between witnessing their leaders' degradation or facing similar treatment themselves. This created impossible moral dilemmas that destroyed the bonds of loyalty and obligation that held medieval society together. Contemporary accounts describe how Sigurd would conduct what he called educational sessions during his tortures, explaining to gathered audiences exactly why each particular punishment was being applied and what lessons observers should draw from the proceedings. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned demonstrations designed to teach specific political and social lessons about the consequences of opposing his authority. The long-term effects of Sigurd's reign created regions where the very concept of resistance became psychologically impossible. Entire generations grew up understanding that challenging authority didn't just risk death but could result in prolonged torments that would destroy not just the rebel but everyone connected to them. This created a form of political paralysis that persisted long after Sigurd's own death as communities remained traumatized by collective memories of his creative cruelty. What made Sigurd's legacy Particularly toxic was how his methods influenced other Viking leaders throughout the region. His success in using elaborate torture as a tool of political control inspired imitators who competed to devise even more horrifying ways to break their enemies' spirits. The techniques he pioneered spread throughout the Viking world like a contagion, fundamentally changing how Norse rulers approached the relationship between violence and authority. From the calculated sadism of Sigurd, we move to a figure whose very existence challenged the boundaries between human cruelty and supernatural evil. Bluetooth Harald, despite his seemingly modern nickname, was a warlord whose reign became synonymous with a level of systematic brutality that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe in purely human terms. Some contemporary sources suggest that witnesses to his actions questioned whether they were observing the work of a mortal man or some demonic entity that had assumed human form. What made Bluetooth Harald particularly terrifying was his ability to combine the organizational skills of a brilliant administrator with the creative sadism of a complete psychopath. Unlike rulers whose cruelty was chaotic or impulsive, Harald approached brutality as a systematic enterprise that required careful planning, detailed record-keeping, and continuous innovation. He maintained what contemporary sources describe as workshops devoted entirely to developing new methods of torture and execution, staffed by specialists who approached their craft with the dedication of master artisans. His treatment of conquered populations reveals the industrial scale of his cruelty. Rather than simply killing or enslaving defeated enemies, Harald would implement what he called educational programs designed to systematically break the cultural and psychological foundations of entire communities. These programs involved separating families, destroying religious and cultural artifacts, and forcing survivors to participate in rituals that violated their deepest beliefs and values. The sources describe Harald's approach to cultural destruction as almost scientific in its thoroughness. He would study the traditions and beliefs of conquered peoples, not out of intellectual curiosity, but to identify the most effective ways to destroy their sense of identity and community. Sacred sites would be desecrated in ways specifically chosen to maximize psychological trauma, while traditional leaders would be subjected to public humiliations designed to break their followers' faith in established authority. What distinguished Harald from other brutal conquerors was his understanding that physical destruction was often less effective than psychological manipulation. He discovered that forcing people to betray their own values and beliefs created a deeper and more lasting trauma than simply terrorizing them through violence. His territories became laboratories for testing different methods of breaking human spirits, with Harald carefully observing the results and refining his techniques based on their effectiveness. His system of informants and collaborators created a network of complicity that extended throughout his territories, forcing ordinary people to become participants in the oppression of their neighbors and communities. This wasn't just surveillance, but a systematic corruption of social relationships, designed to make resistance impossible by destroying the trust and solidarity that rebellion required. Contemporary accounts describe how Harald would conduct elaborate ceremonies designed to celebrate and institutionalize cruelty throughout his realm. These weren't simple displays of power, but carefully orchestrated events that normalized extreme violence and made participation in brutality a requirement for social acceptance. Citizens who refused to attend these ceremonies or who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for the proceedings would themselves become targets for his educational programs. The psychological pressure Harald created was so intense that many of his subjects began to internalize his values, genuinely believing that extreme cruelty was not just necessary but morally justified. This transformation of victims into willing participants in their own oppression represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of his legacy, as it demonstrates how systematic brutality can fundamentally alter human nature itself. His influence extended far beyond his immediate territories through a network of disciples and imitators who spread his methods throughout the Viking world. These weren't just political allies, but true believers who had been converted to Harold's philosophy that cruelty was the most effective tool for achieving social and political objectives. The techniques he developed continued to spread long after his death, creating a legacy of systematic brutality that influenced Viking culture for generations. But the most disturbing aspect of Harold's reign was how he managed to present his systematic cruelty as a form of enlightened governance, convincing many of his subjects that they were fortunate to live under such an effective and organized system of oppression. This ability to make victims grateful for their own suffering represents a level of psychological manipulation that borders on the supernatural, suggesting that Harold possessed an understanding of human nature that was both profound and utterly corrupted. As we delve deeper into these tales of systematic cruelty, we begin to see patterns emerging that reveal something fundamental about how power corrupts and how violence becomes normalized in societies that lose their moral foundations. But our journey through Viking brutality is far from over, as we still need to examine the warlords whose cruelty was so extreme that it transcended mere political strategy and entered the realm of pure evil. The most chilling aspect of these Viking tyrants wasn't just their individual acts of cruelty, but how they systematically corrupted entire societies, turning ordinary people into accomplices in their own oppression. This brings us to Ragnar Hairy Breeches, a warlord whose nickname might sound almost comical to modern ears, but whose methods of psychological warfare were so sophisticated that they fundamentally altered how Viking society understood the relationship between power and fear. What made Ragnar particularly dangerous wasn't his physical prowess or even his tactical brilliance, but his intuitive understanding of human psychology and his ability to weaponize shame and humiliation as tools of conquest. Unlike other Viking leaders who relied primarily on physical intimidation, Ragnar discovered that destroying someone's sense of dignity and self-worth could be far more devastating than simply killing them. He pioneered techniques for breaking enemy morale that went far beyond conventional warfare, creating new categories of suffering that his victims couldn't even adequately describe to their contemporaries. Ragnar's approach to conquest involved what contemporary sources describe as the ritual of degradation. When his forces captured enemy settlements, he wouldn't immediately kill or enslave the population. Instead, he would implement elaborate ceremonies designed to systematically strip away everything that gave people their sense of identity and worth. Noble captives would be forced to perform the most menial and degrading tasks while their former subjects watched, creating a psychological reversal that shattered traditional social hierarchies and left entire communities rudderless and demoralized. The sources describe how Ragnar would force captured kings and YS to serve as entertainment for his warriors, making them perform humiliating dances, recite degrading poems about their own failures, or participate in mock ceremonies that parodied their former. That required careful planning. These weren't random acts
detailed
of cruelty,
record-keeping,
but carefully choreographed performances. He maintained what contemporary sources everyone present as workshops traditional sources of power to developing new methods of torture and confronted with superior force. Staffed by specialists who approached their craft with the dedication of master artisans extended beyond individual treatment. Humiliation to encompass reveals the industrial scale of his cruelty. He understood that Viking, rather than simply killing or enslaving defeated enemies, honor, lineage, and reputation. What he called educational programs designed to systematically break the cultural families and psychological would be forced to denounce of their entire communities. Warriors programs would be made to publicly confess cowardice, destroying and religious and cultural would be compelled to mock their own forcing survivors to participate in rituals that fundamental values created a psychological trauma. The sources describe after the immediate physical destruction as almost scientific. What distinguished Ragnar from other he would study the traditions and beliefs and his understanding that true psychological intellectual dominance required time to develop to identify the most effective ways to destroy their sense of identity and into submission. He would spend months slowly desecrated in ways specifically chosen gradually escalating psychological trauma. Humiliation while traditional leaders would be subjected to public humiliations designed to break their followers' and see themselves in established authority. What distinguished Harold captured from other brutal conquerors perhaps was his understanding. Disturbing that physical destruction was often rather than simply using psychological manipulation or ransom. He discovered that Ragnar would implement their own values and beliefs created a deeper designed and more to break lasting not trauma, just individual simply terrorizing to demonstrate them through entire communities. Territories that became traditional protectors were helpless. These lessons involved elaborate public ceremonies with Harold carefully observing the results and refining gave women status and protection were systematically mocked. His system of informants and collaborators contemporary chroniclers describe how Ragnar's territories became throughout his territories. Normal human relationships became impossible in the oppression of their neighbors and communities. Fear that their words wasn't just surveillance might be twisted into reasons systematic for corruption of social relationships. The psychological pressure designed was so to make resistance that many people began to destroying the trust and avoiding any behavior that rebellion might draw attention. Contemporary accounts describe how Harold would conduct elaborate ceremonies. The long-term effects of Ragnar's psychological warfare created regions throughout his resistance became these weren't simple displays of power. Entire generations grew up understanding that normalized extreme violence and made participation in brutality but could result in public degradations that would citizens destroy not just to attend these ceremonies, but their entire families to demonstrate for sufficient enthusiasm for the creating a form of cultural paralysis for his educational programs. Rebellion, psychological pressure, even when physical so intense, might have many of his subjects began to internalize on other Viking leaders genuinely believing that extreme cruelty was not just he developed for breaking morally human spirits through systematic humiliation spreads into willing participants, inspiring imitators. Oppression represents competed to devise chilling even more sophisticated methods as it demonstrates how systematic the concept that shame can fundamentally alter human nature, a cornerstone of Viking his influence extended far fundamentally changing how Norse warriors approached a network of disciples and imitators who spread his methods throughout the chilling Viking aspect of Ragnar's legacy was how his methods created true believers who had been converted Vikings who genuinely enjoyed inflicting psychological suffering for achieving social and political traditional warriors who might feel some reluctance. He developed continued to spread long after his death. Ragnar's followers, creating a legacy, developed an appetite for creative humiliation that went Viking culture for strategic necessity. But they began to see the disturbing aspect of Harold's human dignity was how he managed to present his systematic cruelty as a form refinement. From the psychological laboratories convincing many of his subjects that they were fortunate to encounter under such an effective organizer whose nickname derived not from his ability to make victims grateful for their own suffering represents a level wherever he traveled. Psychological manipulation represents borders on the supernatural expression, suggesting that Harold possessed an understanding Viking history of human nature who appeared to destroy not and for utterly gain or as we delve deeper into these tales simply because destruction itself we begin to see patterns emerging that satisfaction that nothing fundamental else could provide. About how power what made Halfdan particularly terrifying was his apparent societies that lose coherent their motivation for his cruelty. But our journey through other brutal Viking leaders could at least from claim they were as we still need to examine political objectives whose defending cultural values so extreme that it transcended mere political strategy and entered the realm. If the act of causing pain was the only thing that gave meaning to Viking tyrants wasn't just this purposeless cruelty individual was in some ways more frightening but how they systematically corrupted entire societies. Negotiate ordinary people into accomplices. Contemporary sources describe Halfdan's raids to Ragnar fundamentally different from a warlord whose nickname might sound almost comical where most Norse warriors raided for wealth. Methods of psychological warfare were so sophisticated that primarily interested in maximizing the amount of society understood the relationship between power and fear. Would pass what by made Ragnar particularly dangerous wasn't his physical prowess in order to even his tactical brilliance. But his intuitive, more time understanding of human psychology and his ability to weaponize shame and humiliation as tools of psychological darkness. Unlike other Viking leaders who relied primarily on physical intimidation, work. Ragnar discovered that would keep them alive solely to serve dignity and self-worth could be far more devastating than simply killing them. He maintained what contemporary chroniclers describe as collections of prisoners went far beyond conventional warfare, purpose creating new to satisfy categories of suffering that his victims couldn't even adequately describe. The sources describe how Halfdan Ragnar's approach to conquest what he called investigations into the nature of suffering as the ritual of degradation, subjecting prisoners when his forces captured enemy settlements, tortures he wouldn't immediately observing their or enslave the population. These weren't interrogations. He would implement elaborate ceremonies designed to systematically strip away everything that gave people their sense giving new ways of identity to break human spirits. Noble captives would be forced to perform the methodical nature of these experiments suggests tasks while their former subjects approached cruelty with creating the same psychological curiosity that other people might bring to social hierarchies and left entire communities what distinguished Halfdan from other psychopathic leaders describe how Ragnar would force capture kings similar darkness in his followers. Entertainment unlike for his rulers whose brutality making them perform humiliating largely personal, Halfdan managed to corrupt degrading poems about their own failures. Viking warriors participate in mock enthusiastic that parodied their former in his purposeless campaigns of suffering. His men began to compete with each other to devise new tortures and humiliations, creating a culture of cruelty that fed on itself and grew more extreme with each iteration. His approach to conquest involved what can only be described as the systematic cultivation of despair. Rather than simply defeating enemy forces and occupying their territories, Halfdan would implement long-term campaigns designed to slowly drain all hope and meaning from the lives of conquered populations. These campaigns could last for years, gradually escalating in intensity until entire regions became psychological wastelands where people existed in states of constant anxiety and hopelessness. Contemporary accounts describe how Halfdan's territories became places where normal human emotions began to atrophy. The constant exposure to random violence and purposeless cruelty created populations that were psychologically numb, incapable of forming genuine relationships or experiencing joy even when circumstances might otherwise have permitted it. This emotional deadness was perhaps more devastating than physical destruction, as it robbed people of the inner resources they needed to rebuild their lives or resist their oppressors. The psychological contagion that Halfdan created extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect entire regions of Scandinavia. Communities that had never directly encountered his forces would modify their behavior based on stories they had heard about his methods, creating a climate of preemptive fear that made normal social and economic life increasingly difficult. The mere possibility that Halfdan might appear became a source of chronic anxiety that poisoned relationships and undermined community solidarity. His influence on Viking culture was particularly toxic because he demonstrated that cruelty could become an end in itself rather than merely a means to achieve other objectives. This philosophical shift fundamentally altered how many Norse warriors understood violence, transforming it from a necessary tool for survival and advancement into a source of entertainment and personal fulfillment. The long-term consequences of this transformation would haunt Scandinavian society for generations. But the most disturbing aspect of Halfdan's legacy was how he proved that human beings could be systematically trained to enjoy inflicting suffering on their fellow humans. His territories became proving grounds for testing the limits of human moral corruption, demonstrating that, under the right conditions, ordinary people could be transformed into enthusiastic participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty imaginable. Moving from the nihilistic darkness of Halfdan, we encounter Sweyn Forkbeard, Danish king whose reign represented the industrialization of Viking brutality. Where previous tyrants had approached cruelty as either a personal passion or a strategic tool, Sweyn transformed systematic violence into a governmental institution, creating bureaucratic systems for organizing and implementing terror on an unprecedented scale. What made Sweyn particularly dangerous was his organizational genius combined with his complete lack of moral restraint. He understood that individual acts of cruelty, however extreme, had limited impact compared to systematic campaigns of terror that could be sustained over long periods and applied consistently across vast territories. His reign marked the transition from personal tyranny to institutional oppression, creating governmental structures specifically designed to maximize suffering and fear. Sweyn's approach to governance involved the creation of what contemporary sources describe as departments of intimidation, staffed by specialists who approach terror as a professional discipline requiring specific skills and training. These weren't random collections of brutal thugs, but organized bureaucracies with clear hierarchies, standardized procedures and performance metrics based on their effectiveness in breaking resistance and maintaining fear. The sources describe how Swain would conduct regular reviews of his terror operations, analyzing which techniques were most effective in different contexts and refining his methods based on empirical results. This systematic approach to cruelty allowed him to achieve levels of psychological control that individual tyrants could never sustain. As his institutional systems could operate independently of his personal presence or attention, his treatment of conquered territories reveals the industrial scale of his operations. Rather than simply appointing governors or extracting tribute, Swain would implement comprehensive systems for monitoring and controlling every aspect of daily life in occupied regions. These systems involved networks of informants, regular public demonstrations of power, and carefully calibrated punishments designed to maintain optimal levels of fear without completely destroying the economic productivity of subject populations. What distinguished Swain from other organized tyrants was his understanding that sustainable oppression required popular participation. He created incentive systems that rewarded citizens for reporting suspicious behavior, participating in public punishments, and demonstrating enthusiasm for his regime's values. These systems gradually corrupted entire societies, turning neighbors into informants and friends into potential enemies. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Swain's territories became places where collaboration with oppression became the price of survival, creating moral compromises that destroyed the psychological foundations of community life. People were forced to choose between protecting their families and maintaining their integrity, with most choosing survival over principle, and then living with the psychological consequences of their moral capitulation. His approach to resistance was particularly sophisticated, involving multi-stage processes designed to identify, isolate, and systematically destroy opposition movements before they could gain momentum, rather than simply responding to rebellion after it occurred. Swain systems were designed to detect and eliminate potential resistance while it was still in the planning stages, creating a preemptive approach to terror that made organized opposition virtually impossible. The psychological impact of living under Swain's systematic oppression was devastating in ways that individual acts of cruelty could never achieve. The knowledge that every conversation might be monitored, every relationship might be compromised, and every action might be subject to official scrutiny created a level of chronic stress that fundamentally altered how people related to each other and to their own thoughts and feelings. His influence extended throughout the Viking world through a network of disciples who exported his institutional approaches to terror to other kingdoms and territories. These weren't just political allies, but true converts to his philosophy that systematic oppression was the most effective form of governance, creating a generation of rulers who competed to refine and improve upon his methods. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Swain's legacy was how he demonstrated that systematic cruelty could become self-sustaining, creating governmental and social structures that continued to operate effectively long after their original architect had passed from the scene. His institutional approach to terror proved that oppression could be transformed from a personal characteristic of individual tyrants into a permanent feature of political systems, making resistance not just dangerous but seemingly futile. The progression from individual psychopaths like Eric Bloodaxe to institutional tyrants like Swain Forkbeard reveals something profound about how evil evolves and adapts to become more effective over time. But even Swain's systematic approach to terror pales in comparison to our final figure, a man whose very name became synonymous with the complete destruction of human hope and the transformation of entire regions into landscapes of perpetual nightmare. This journey through the darkest chapters of Viking history reveals how individual cruelty can metastasize into systematic oppression, transforming entire societies and leaving psychological scars that persist for generations. But we're not finished exploring the depths of Viking brutality. As the worst Examples of human evil are yet to come in our examination of these blood-soaked northern tyrants. As we reach the pinnacle of Viking brutality, we encounter Harald Hardrada, whose very name translates to hard ruler, though this translation barely captures the essence of a man who redefined what it meant to be feared throughout medieval Europe. Harald didn't just rule through terror. He transformed terror itself into a sophisticated art form that combined the psychological insights of a master manipulator with the creative sadism of a complete monster. His reign represents the absolute peak of Viking cruelty, where systematic oppression evolved into something approaching supernatural evil. What made Harald uniquely terrifying was his ability to combine every technique pioneered by his brutal predecessors, while adding innovations that surpassed them all in terms of sheer psychological devastation. He had studied the methods of Eric Bloodaxe, Ivar the Boneless, and Swine Forkbeard, but rather than simply copying their approaches, he synthesized their techniques into something far more horrifying than the sum of its parts. Harald's understanding of human psychology was so profound that contemporary chroniclers began to question whether he possessed some form of supernatural insight into the human soul. He could look at a person and immediately identify their deepest fears, their strongest loyalties, and their most vulnerable psychological pressure points. This wasn't intuition but a systematic study of human nature that he had pursued with the same dedication that other men devoted to warfare or statecraft. His approach to breaking prisoners reveals the sophisticated nature of his psychological warfare. Rather than relying on physical torture alone, Harald would conduct what he called conversations with the soul, extended interrogations that could last for weeks or months. These sessions weren't designed to extract information, but to systematically dismantle everything that gave his victims their sense of identity and purpose. He would force prisoners to confront their own moral compromises, their secret shames, and their deepest hypocrisies until they began to see themselves as he saw them, worthless and contemptible. The sources describe how Harald would use these psychological dissections to create what he termed willing slaves, prisoners who had been so thoroughly broken that they genuinely believed they deserved their suffering and were grateful for any small mercy he might show them. These broken souls would become his most effective agents as their visible transformation from proud warriors to groveling servants demonstrated to others the futility of resistance more powerfully than any display of physical force could achieve. His treatment of entire populations reveals the industrial scale of his psychological operations. When Harald conquered new territories, he would implement comprehensive programs designed to identify and systematically corrupt the moral and cultural foundations of entire societies. These programs involved forcing communities to participate in rituals that violated their deepest values, creating collective guilt and shame that made resistance psychologically impossible. Contemporary accounts describe how Harald would organize elaborate festivals of degradation where entire populations would be forced to participate in ceremonies designed to mock and destroy their own cultural traditions. Parents would be compelled to denounce their children. Priests would be made to blaspheme against their own gods. And warriors would be forced to publicly confess acts of cowardice they had never committed. These festivals weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated events designed to create collective trauma that would persist for generations. What distinguished Harald from all previous tyrants was his understanding that true power lay not in controlling people's actions, but in controlling their thoughts and feelings. He discovered that people who had been forced to betray their own values would internalize a sense of worthlessness that made them more controllable than any external threat could achieve. His territories became laboratories for testing the limits of psychological manipulation, with Harald constantly refining his techniques based on their effectiveness in breaking human spirits. His system of corruption extended to every level of society from the highest nobles to the lowest peasants. Harald understood that sustainable oppression required the active participation of the oppressed. So he created incentive structures that made collaboration with his regime seem like the only rational choice for survival. People weren't just afraid of Harold. They became invested in his success because opposing him would require confronting their own complicity in his crimes. The psychological contagion that Harold created was so powerful that it began to affect his own followers, transforming ordinary Viking warriors into enthusiastic participants in systematic cruelty. His armies became composed not of reluctant soldiers following orders, but of true believers who had been converted to his philosophy that causing suffering was not just necessary, but morally justified. These men would compete with each other to devise new tortures and humiliations, creating a culture of cruelty that fed on itself and grew more extreme with each iteration. His approach to resistance was perhaps the most sophisticated ever developed by any medieval ruler. Rather than simply punishing rebels after they acted, Harold created systems for identifying and corrupting potential opponents before they could organize effective resistance. He understood that most rebellions were motivated by moral outrage, so he focused on destroying the moral foundations that made resistance psychologically possible. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Harold would target the families and communities of potential rebels, not with physical violence but with systematic campaigns designed to compromise their moral authority and social standing. A potential rebel leader might find that his children were being rewarded for denouncing their parents, his wife was being honored for reporting his private conversations, and his closest friends were being promoted for demonstrating their loyalty to the regime. These campaigns created psychological isolation that made resistance seem not just dangerous but pointless. The long-term effects of Harold's reign created regions where normal human relationships became impossible. Trust, loyalty, love, and friendship all became potential sources of vulnerability that could be exploited by his agents. People learned to guard their thoughts and feelings even from their closest family members, creating a psychological landscape where genuine human connection was too dangerous to risk. His influence on the broader Viking world was profound and lasting. The techniques he developed spread throughout Scandinavia and beyond, inspiring imitators who exported his methods to other kingdoms and cultures. Harold had proven that systematic psychological warfare could be more effective than traditional military conquest, fundamentally changing how rulers throughout medieval Europe understood the relationship between power and fear. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Harold's legacy was his demonstration that human beings could be systematically transformed into willing participants in their own oppression. His territories became proving grounds for testing the limits of moral corruption, showing that under the right conditions, ordinary people could be made to embrace values that were completely antithetical to their original beliefs and principles. The progression from Harold's individual tyranny to systematic institutional oppression represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, revealing how evil can evolve and adapt to become more effective over time. His methods created psychological scars that persisted long after his death, influencing how entire cultures understood concepts like loyalty, authority, and moral responsibility. Contemporary sources suggest that Harold's reign marked a turning point in Viking culture, transforming a society that had traditionally valued courage, honor, and individual achievement into one that prioritized survival, compliance, and collective submission. The warriors who had once prided themselves on their independence and fierce loyalty to their chosen leaders became servants of a system that demanded complete psychological surrender in exchange for basic survival. The techniques Harold pioneered for breaking human spirits became so effective that they continued to be used long after their original purpose had been achieved. Communities that had been subjected to his psychological warfare remained traumatized and compliant for generations, passing down patterns of submission and self-censorship to their children and grandchildren. The cultural damage he inflicted proved to be far more lasting than any physical destruction could have been. His approach to governance created what contemporary observers described as kingdoms of the walking dead. Territories populated by people who were technically alive but had been so thoroughly broken that they existed in states of emotional numbness and psychological paralysis. These populations became incapable of genuine resistance, creative thinking, or independent action, creating societies that were stable but completely stagnant. The psychological techniques Harold developed were so sophisticated that they influenced military and political thinking throughout medieval Europe and beyond. Rulers who had never directly encountered his methods began to adopt similar approaches to controlling their subjects, creating a contagion of systematic oppression that spread far beyond the original Viking territories. His legacy reveals something fundamental about human nature that most people prefer not to acknowledge: that under the right conditions, ordinary individuals can be transformed into enthusiastic participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty and oppression. Harold's reign proved that evil is not just a characteristic of individual psychopaths, but a systematic force that can be cultivated, refined, and institutionalized to achieve levels of control that physical force alone could never accomplish. But Harald Hardrada was not the final word in Viking brutality. As his methods spread and evolved, they gave rise to even more sophisticated forms of systematic cruelty that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The techniques he pioneered for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations became tools that would be used by tyrants and oppressors throughout history, creating a legacy of suffering that extends far beyond the Viking Age. Moving beyond individual tyrants to examine the systematic nature of Viking brutality, we begin to understand how these methods of terror became embedded in the very fabric of Norse society. The transition from personal cruelty to institutional oppression represents one of the most significant developments in the history of systematic evil, showing how individual psychopaths can create systems that perpetuate their cruelty long after they themselves have passed from the scene. The evolution of Viking brutality from the personal sadism of Eric Bloodaxe to the institutional terror of Harald Hardrada reveals a progression that mirrors the development of evil throughout human history. Each generation of tyrants built upon the techniques of their predecessors, refining and systematizing methods of control until they created forms of oppression that were far more effective and lasting than anything achieved through individual cruelty alone. This systematic approach to terror created changes in Viking society that persisted long after the original tyrants had died. Communities that had been subjected to these psychological warfare techniques remained damaged for generations, unable to rebuild the social trust and moral foundations that had been systematically destroyed. The cultural trauma inflicted by these rulers became embedded in the collective memory of their societies, influencing how people understood concepts like authority, resistance, and moral responsibility. The techniques pioneered by these Viking tyrants didn't remain confined to Scandinavia, but spread throughout medieval Europe and beyond, influencing how rulers throughout the known world understood the relationship between power and fear. The systematic approaches to psychological manipulation that had been developed in Viking territories became tools that would be used by oppressors and tyrants for centuries to come, creating a legacy of institutionalized cruelty that extends far beyond the original context of their creation. As we examine these patterns of systematic brutality, we begin to see how individual evil can metastasize into institutional oppression, creating systems of control that become self-perpetuating and increasingly sophisticated over time. The Viking tyrants we've examined represent not just individual monsters, but pioneers in the systematic study and application of psychological warfare. Men who transformed cruelty from a personal characteristic into a governmental institution. The psychological techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations became so effective that they continued to influence human civilization long after the Viking Age had ended. Their methods provided blueprints for systematic oppression that would be adopted and refined by tyrants throughout history, creating a dark legacy that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. But the story of Viking brutality extends beyond even these systematic approaches to terror, encompassing forms of cruelty and oppression that challenge our understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. The darkest chapters of this history reveal not just individual monsters or institutional systems, but something approaching pure evil in its most concentrated and refined form. The psychological landscapes created by these Viking tyrants represent some of the most thorough destructions of human dignity and moral agency ever recorded in historical sources. Their territories became laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and the boundaries of moral corruption. Places where the fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization were systematically challenged and destroyed. Contemporary observers struggled to find adequate language to describe what they witnessed in these kingdoms of terror, suggesting that the experiences being inflicted went beyond normal categories of human suffering and entered realms that challenged basic assumptions about what was possible in human relationships. The systematic nature of the cruelty being practiced created new categories of trauma and damage that existing moral and psychological frameworks were inadequate to address. The legacy of these Viking tyrants extends far beyond their immediate historical context, providing insights into the fundamental nature of human evil and the conditions under which ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in systematic oppression. Their methods revealed aspects of human psychology and social organization that most people prefer not to acknowledge, demonstrating how quickly civilization can collapse when fear becomes the primary organizing principle of society. As we continue our examination of these blood-soaked chapters of Viking history, we begin to understand that we're not just studying individual monsters or historical curiosities, but examining fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which evil can flourish and spread. The techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations represent some of the most sophisticated approaches to systematic oppression ever devised, creating legacies that continue to influence human civilization to this day. The progression from individual cruelty to systematic terror that we've traced through these Viking rulers reveals patterns that extend far beyond their immediate historical context, providing insights into how evil evolves and adapts to become more effective over time. Their innovations in psychological warfare and systematic oppression created templates that would be used by tyrants and oppressors throughout subsequent history, establishing precedents for institutional cruelty that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. But our journey through the darkest chapters of Viking brutality is approaching its most disturbing revelations. As we prepare to examine the ultimate expressions of systematic evil that emerged from this culture of institutionalized terror, the techniques and methods we've explored so far represent merely the foundation for even more sophisticated and devastating approaches to human oppression that would push the boundaries of what civilized people believed was possible. In human relationships, the culmination of Viking brutality reached its absolute peak with Thorin's skull splitter, whose very existence seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions about what human beings were capable of becoming. Unlike the systematic tyrants we've examined, Thorin represented something that transcended mere political oppression or strategic cruelty, embodying a form of evil so pure and concentrated that contemporary chroniclers questioned whether they were witnessing the actions of a mortal man or some demonic entity that had assumed human form to inflict maximum suffering upon the world. What distinguished Thorin from every other brutal ruler we've encountered was his complete transcendence of human motivation. Where Eric Bloodaxe killed for power, Ivar tortured for conquest, and Harold manipulated for control, Thorin seemed to operate from a realm beyond human understanding, pursuing objectives that made sense only within the twisted logic of absolute evil. His actions couldn't be explained by greed, ambition, revenge, or even sadistic pleasure. but seemed to flow from some fundamental commitment to maximizing the amount of suffering and despair present in the world. Contemporary sources describe Thorin's approach to conquest as fundamentally different from anything that had come before. His forces didn't raid for wealth, territory, or strategic advantage, but seemed to seek out opportunities to inflict the maximum possible psychological damage on their victims. They would bypass rich targets that offered substantial plunder to attack communities where they could spend more time conducting what Thorin called experiments in the nature of despair. Elaborate tortures designed not to extract information or demonstrate power, but to explore the absolute limits of human endurance. His treatment of captured populations reveals the systematic nature of his approach to creating suffering. Rather than simply killing or enslaving defeated enemies, Thorin would implement what he termed educational programs in the reality of powerlessness. Complex psychological campaigns designed to strip away every source of meaning, hope, and identity that gave people reason to continue existing. These programs could last for months or even years, gradually escalating in their psychological sophistication until entire communities existed in states of living death, technically alive but completely broken in spirit. The sources describe how Thorin would study his victims with the same methodical attention that scholars devoted to understanding natural phenomena, carefully observing their responses to different forms of psychological pressure and refining his techniques based on their effectiveness in breaking human spirits. He maintained detailed records of his experiments, creating what contemporary chroniclers describe as libraries of human suffering that cataloged the most effective methods for destroying hope, faith, love, and every other emotion that made life worth living. What made Thorin's methods particularly horrifying was their complete lack of practical purpose. Unlike other tyrants who use cruelty as a means to achieve political or military objectives, Thorin seemed to pursue suffering as an end in itself, as if the act of causing pain was the only thing that gave meaning to his existence. This purposeless evil was far more terrifying than strategic brutality because it couldn't be negotiated with, reasoned with, or even properly understood by normal human psychology. His approach to psychological warfare involved techniques so sophisticated that they challenged contemporary understanding of human nature itself. Thorin had discovered methods for making people complicit in their own destruction, creating psychological dynamics where victims would actively participate in increasing their own suffering while believing they were making rational choices for survival. These techniques created forms of trauma so profound that they fundamentally altered how people understood concepts like choice, responsibility, and moral agency. Contemporary accounts describe how Thorin's territories became places where normal categories of human experience ceased to function. Love became a source of vulnerability that could be exploited for torture. Hope became a weakness that invited greater suffering. And faith became a target for systematic destruction. People learned to suppress every positive emotion because displaying any sign of happiness or contentment would immediately draw Thorin's attention and result in elaborate punishments designed to crush whatever spark of joy had dared to manifest itself. His influence on his followers was perhaps even more disturbing than his direct victims' experiences. Thorin possessed an uncanny ability to identify individuals who possessed latent capacities for extreme cruelty and to cultivate these tendencies until they flowered into enthusiastic sadism. His armies became composed not of reluctant soldiers following orders but of true disciples who had been converted to his philosophy that causing suffering was the highest form of human achievement. The psychological contagion that Thorin created spread throughout his territories like a plague, infecting everyone who came into contact with his methods and philosophy. Ordinary people began to compete with each other to demonstrate their loyalty to his regime by devising new forms of cruelty to inflict on their neighbors and family members. Communities that had once been characterized by mutual support and cooperation became landscapes of suspicion, betrayal, and casual brutality where everyone lived in constant fear of being targeted by their own relatives and friends. His approach to resistance was so sophisticated that it prevented opposition from even forming in the minds of potential rebels. Rather than waiting for resistance to manifest and then crushing it, Thorin created psychological conditions that made the very concept of resistance literally unthinkable. He understood that rebellion required hope, and he systematically eliminated every possible source of hope from his territories until people became incapable of imagining that their circumstances could ever improve. The techniques Thorin developed for destroying hope were so effective that they created what contemporary observers described as kingdoms of the living dead, territories populated by people who continued to breathe and move, but had been so thoroughly broken that they existed in states of complete emotional numbness. These populations became incapable of joy, love, creativity, or any other positive emotion, creating societies that were stable but utterly devoid of anything that made human existence worthwhile. His methods for corrupting moral foundations were equally devastating. Thorin discovered that people could be made to betray their deepest values through carefully constructed moral dilemmas that made betrayal seem like the only rational choice for survival. Parents would be forced to choose between saving one child by sacrificing another. Communities would be compelled to select members for torture to spare the rest. And religious leaders would be made to choose between blasphemy and watching their congregations suffer. These forced moral compromises created psychological damage that persisted long after the immediate threats had passed. People who had been forced to make such choices would internalize feelings of guilt and self-hatred that made them more controllable than any external threat could achieve. They would come to see themselves as fundamentally corrupted and unworthy of redemption, creating a psychological prison that was far more effective than any physical confinement. The systematic nature of Thorin's approach to evil created changes in human psychology that challenged fundamental assumptions about moral agency and personal responsibility. His victims didn't just suffer physical pain or emotional trauma, but experienced what can only be described as spiritual annihilation, the complete destruction of everything that gave their existence meaning and purpose. This form of damage was so profound that it couldn't be healed through normal processes of recovery and healing, but required the complete reconstruction of basic assumptions about reality and human relationships. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate language to describe what they witnessed in Thorin's territories, suggesting that the experiences being inflicted transcended normal categories of human suffering and entered realms that challenged basic assumptions about what was possible in human relationships. The systematic nature of the cruelty being practiced created new categories of trauma and damage that existing moral and psychological frameworks were inadequate to address. His influence extended far beyond his immediate territories through networks of disciples who exported his methods to other kingdoms and cultures throughout the known world. These weren't just political allies or military commanders, but true converts to his philosophy. That systematic suffering was the highest form of human achievement. They established schools and institutions, devoted to refining and perfecting his techniques, creating legacies of institutionalized cruelty that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The psychological techniques Thorin developed were so sophisticated that they continued to evolve and spread long after his death, adapted and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors who built upon his innovations to create even more effective methods of systematic control. His discoveries about human psychology and the conditions under which people could be made to betray their deepest values became foundational knowledge for anyone seeking to establish and maintain absolute power over human populations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Thorin's legacy was his demonstration that evil could become self-perpetuating, creating systems and institutions that continued to generate suffering long after their original architect had passed from the scene. His territories became laboratories for testing the limits of human moral corruption, proving that, under the right conditions, ordinary people could be systematically transformed into enthusiastic participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty imaginable. The progression from individual psychopaths to systematic institutional oppression that we've traced through these Viking rulers represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of human evil, revealing how individual cruelty can metastasize into cultural pathologies that persist for generations. Thorin's innovations in psychological warfare created templates for systematic oppression that would be used by tyrants throughout subsequent history, establishing precedents for institutional cruelty that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Moving beyond individual tyrants to examine the broader cultural impact of systematic brutality, we begin to understand how these methods of terror became embedded in the very fabric of Norse society. The transformation of Viking culture from a warrior society that valued courage and honor into a landscape of systematic oppression reveals something fundamental about how evil spreads and adapts to become more effective over time. The techniques pioneered by these brutal rulers didn't remain confined to their immediate territories, but spread throughout Scandinavia and beyond, creating a contagion of systematic cruelty that influenced military and political thinking throughout medieval Europe. Rulers who had never directly encountered these methods began to adopt similar approaches to controlling their subjects, recognizing the effectiveness of psychological warfare in maintaining power and preventing resistance. The cultural trauma inflicted by these systematic approaches to terror created changes in human psychology that persisted long after the original tyrants had died. Communities that had been subjected to these forms of psychological warfare remained damaged for generations, unable to rebuild the social trust and moral foundations that had been systematically destroyed. The collective memory of these experiences became embedded in cultural traditions and social institutions, influencing how people understood concepts like authority, loyalty, and moral responsibility. Contemporary sources describe how the spread of these techniques created what can only be termed an epidemic of systematic cruelty. Throughout the Viking world, communities that had once been characterized by mutual support and cooperation became landscapes of suspicion and betrayal where everyone lived in constant fear of being targeted by their own neighbors and family members. The psychological methods developed by individual tyrants became normalized aspects of social interaction, creating cultures where casual brutality was seen as natural and necessary for survival. The institutionalization of these approaches to psychological warfare created governmental and social structures that were specifically designed to maintain optimal levels of fear and despair throughout entire populations. These systems became so sophisticated that they could operate independently of individual leaders, creating forms of oppression that were far more stable and enduring than anything that depended on the personal characteristics of particular rulers. The long-term effects of this systematic approach to terror extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence the fundamental character of Viking civilization itself. The culture that had once produced explorers, artists, and innovators became focused primarily on the refinement and application of techniques for causing suffering. Creative energies that might otherwise have been devoted to building and creating were instead channeled into devising ever more sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation and control. The psychological landscape created by these systematic approaches to evil became so pervasive that it influenced how people throughout the Viking world understood basic concepts of human relationships and social organization. Trust, loyalty, love, and friendship all became potential sources of vulnerability that could be exploited by those in power, creating social environments where genuine human connection was too dangerous to risk. The spread of these techniques created what contemporary observers described as a fundamental transformation in the character of Norse civilization, changing it from a culture that celebrated individual achievement and heroic action into one that prioritized survival, compliance, and collective submission. The warriors who had once prided themselves on their independence and fierce loyalty to chosen leaders became servants of systems that demanded complete psychological surrender in exchange for basic survival. This cultural transformation had profound implications for how Viking society understood concepts like courage, honor, and moral responsibility. The traditional values that had defined Norse identity became liabilities in environments where displaying any sign of independence or moral conviction could result in systematic psychological torture. People learned to suppress their deepest beliefs and values, creating internal psychological landscapes that mirrored the external environments of systematic oppression they inhabited. The techniques developed by these brutal rulers for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations became so refined that they influenced military and political thinking throughout the medieval world and beyond. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided blueprints for systematic oppression that would be adopted and adapted by tyrants and oppressors throughout subsequent history, creating legacies of institutionalized cruelty that continue to influence human civilization to this day. The evolution of Viking brutality from individual sadism to systematic institutional terror represents a case study in how evil adapts and evolves to become more effective over time. Each generation of tyrants built upon the innovations of their predecessors, creating increasingly sophisticated approaches to psychological manipulation and control that pushed the boundaries of what civilized people believed was possible in human relationships. But the story of these terrible Viking kings and warlords reveals something even more disturbing about human nature itself, demonstrating the conditions under which ordinary people can be systematically transformed into willing participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty and oppression. Their methods proved that evil is not just a characteristic of individual psychopaths, but a systematic force that can be cultivated, refined, and institutionalized to achieve levels of control that physical force alone could never accomplish. The psychological techniques these rulers developed were so sophisticated that they created new categories of human experience that existing moral and philosophical frameworks were inadequate to address. Their territories became testing grounds for exploring the absolute limits of human endurance and the boundaries of moral corruption, revealing aspects of human psychology that most people prefer not to acknowledge or understand. As we examine the broader implications of their legacy, we begin to see how the techniques they pioneered for systematic oppression continue to influence human civilization centuries after the Viking Age ended. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided foundational knowledge for anyone seeking to establish and maintain absolute power over human populations, creating templates for institutional cruelty that have been adapted and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors. The cultural damage inflicted by these systematic approaches to terror created psychological scars that persisted for generations, influencing how entire societies understood concepts like authority, resistance, and moral agency. Communities that had been subjected to these forms of psychological warfare remained traumatized long after the immediate threats had passed, unable to rebuild the social trust and cultural foundations that had been systematically destroyed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of their legacy is how it demonstrates the fragility of human civilization itself, showing how quickly societies can collapse when fear becomes the primary organizing principle of social life. The techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations revealed that the psychological foundations of civilized behavior are far more vulnerable than most people realize, capable of being systematically undermined and destroyed through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare. The progression from individual brutality to institutional terror that we've traced through these Viking rulers provides insights into fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which evil can flourish and spread. Their methods created precedents for systematic oppression that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world, establishing patterns of institutional cruelty that persist long after their original contexts have disappeared. As we prepare to conclude our examination of these blood-soaked chapters of Viking history, we must confront the disturbing reality that their innovations in systematic cruelty represent not just historical curiosities, but ongoing challenges to human civilization itself. The techniques they developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations continue to pose threats to the psychological and cultural foundations of free societies, requiring constant vigilance and active resistance to prevent their resurgence in new forms. The legacy of these terrible Viking kings and warlords extends far beyond their immediate historical context, providing dark lessons about the nature of human evil and the conditions under which it can flourish and spread. Their methods revealed that the capacity for extreme cruelty exists within human nature itself, waiting to be cultivated and refined under the right circumstances to create forms of systematic oppression that challenge the very foundations of civilized behavior. The systematic approaches to terror that emerged from Viking culture represent some of the most sophisticated and effective methods of psychological warfare ever developed, creating legacies that continue to influence human civilization centuries after their original context has disappeared. Their innovations in breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations establish precedents for institutional cruelty that have been adapted and refined by tyrants throughout subsequent history, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their dark legacy to understanding the ongoing challenges facing human freedom and dignity. The systematic destruction these Viking tyrants achieved didn't end with their deaths, but created what can only be described as hereditary trauma that passed from generation to generation. Like a psychological plague, children who grew up in territories controlled by these monsters developed fundamentally different relationships with concepts like trust, authority, and human connection. They learned to view cruelty not as an aberration but as the natural state of human relationships, creating populations that were psychologically predisposed to accept and even participate in systematic oppression. This generational transmission of trauma created what contemporary sources describe as kingdoms of inherited despair, where entire populations had internalized the values and methods of their oppressors to such an extent that they became self-policing. Parents would preemptively betray their own children to demonstrate loyalty to the regime, while children would report their parents' private conversations to avoid being suspected of disloyalty themselves. The psychological damage had become so complete that external enforcement was often unnecessary because people had learned to oppress themselves. The most disturbing aspect of this inherited trauma was how it created what can only be termed a cultural appetite for cruelty. Populations that had been systematically brutalized for generations began to view causing suffering as a normal and even desirable aspect of human interaction. They would compete with each other to demonstrate their capacity for inflicting pain on others, seeing sadistic creativity as a valuable social skill that could improve their standing within the community. Contemporary chroniclers describe how these damaged populations would celebrate acts of cruelty with the same enthusiasm that healthy societies might reserve for artistic achievements or military victories. Public tortures became entertainment, events that drew enthusiastic crowds, while those who demonstrated particular skill in devising new forms of suffering were honored as cultural heroes worthy of emulation and respect. This cultural transformation created societies where empathy and compassion were not just discouraged but actively punished as signs of weakness and disloyalty. Children who showed natural inclinations toward kindness would be subjected to corrective education designed to eliminate these dangerous tendencies before they could develop into threats to social stability. The systematic suppression of positive emotions created populations that were emotionally stunted, capable of experiencing only fear, anger, and the twisted satisfaction that came from inflicting suffering on others. The economic implications of this systematic brutalization were equally devastating. Societies that devoted their creative energies to refining methods of torture and psychological manipulation inevitably neglected the productive activities that sustained civilization. Trade relationships collapsed as Communities became too damaged to engage in normal commercial interactions, while agricultural and craft production declined as people focused their attention on survival and the infliction of suffering rather than creation and improvement. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this cultural decay was how it became self-perpetuating, creating feedback loops that made recovery increasingly impossible over time. Each generation was more damaged than the last, with fewer memories of what healthy human relationships might look like and less capacity for the trust and cooperation that would be necessary to rebuild functional communities. The psychological foundations of civilization were being systematically eroded, creating societies that existed in states of perpetual decline with no apparent path toward recovery. The techniques these Viking tyrants developed for breaking human spirits proved to be remarkably adaptable, spreading beyond their original context to influence cultures throughout medieval Europe and beyond. Rulers in distant kingdoms began adopting similar methods after hearing reports of their effectiveness, creating a contagion of systematic cruelty that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. The innovations pioneered in Viking territories became foundational knowledge for anyone seeking to establish absolute control over human populations. This spread of systematic oppression techniques created what can only be described as an arms race in psychological warfare, with different rulers competing to develop ever more sophisticated methods for breaking human resistance and maintaining control. The knowledge accumulated through centuries of experimentation in human suffering became a dark science that was studied, refined, and passed down through networks of tyrants and their disciples. The psychological insights gained through these systematic campaigns of terror revealed disturbing truths about human nature that challenged fundamental assumptions about moral agency and personal responsibility. The tyrants discovered that virtually anyone could be broken given sufficient time and the application of appropriate psychological pressure, and that people who had been systematically corrupted could become enthusiastic participants in the oppression of others. These discoveries about the malleability of human psychology had profound implications for understanding the nature of evil itself. The Viking tyrants proved that cruelty was not just an individual characteristic, but a systematic force that could be cultivated and spread throughout entire populations, creating cultures where causing suffering became normalized and even celebrated as a positive social value. The institutional systems these rulers created for maintaining psychological control became models that would be studied and adapted by oppressive regimes throughout subsequent history. Their innovations in surveillance, informant networks, and psychological manipulation provided blueprints for totalitarian control that would be refined and implemented by tyrants across different cultures and time periods. The long-term consequences of their systematic approach to human oppression extended far beyond their immediate victims to influence the fundamental trajectory of human civilization itself. The techniques they developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations created precedents that would be invoked and adapted by subsequent generations of oppressors, establishing patterns of institutional cruelty that persist in various forms to this day. Contemporary sources suggest that the psychological damage inflicted by these systematic campaigns of terror was so profound that it fundamentally altered the genetic and cultural inheritance of entire populations. Communities that had been subjected to generations of systematic brutalization developed what can only be described as hereditary predispositions toward violence and cruelty, passing down through biological and cultural mechanisms. The psychological adaptations that had been necessary for survival under extreme oppression. This hereditary transmission of trauma created populations that were psychologically predisposed to both inflict and accept extreme levels of violence and suffering. Children born into these damaged communities would exhibit signs of psychological disturbance from early ages, displaying levels of aggression and callousness that suggested the trauma of their ancestors had become embedded in their fundamental psychological architecture. The scientific implications of these observations challenged contemporary understanding of how psychological characteristics could be transmitted across generations. The systematic nature of the trauma inflicted by these Viking tyrants seemed to have created changes in human psychology that persisted long after the original sources of oppression had disappeared, suggesting that extreme psychological stress could create heritable modifications that affected the basic structure of human personality and moral reasoning. The cultural institutions that emerged from these damaged populations reflected their fundamental psychological distortions, creating legal systems that celebrated cruelty, educational practices that trained children in methods of inflicting suffering, and religious traditions that worshipped violence and pain as divine principles. These institutional structures became self-reinforcing, ensuring that the psychological damage would continue to be transmitted across generations, even in the absence of external oppression. The economic and social consequences of this systematic psychological damage created what contemporary observers described as civilizations of the damned societies that possessed all the technical capabilities necessary for prosperity and growth but were psychologically incapable of using these capabilities for constructive purposes. Their creative energies were channeled entirely into devising new methods of causing suffering, while their organizational skills were devoted to perfecting systems of oppression and control. These damaged societies became sources of instability throughout the medieval world, as their populations were psychologically incapable of maintaining peaceful relationships with neighboring communities. Their fundamental orientation toward violence and cruelty made them natural aggressors who would inevitably seek to export their psychological pathologies to other regions through conquest and cultural influence. The spread of these psychological pathologies created what can only be described as epidemics of systematic cruelty that swept across entire regions, transforming healthy communities into landscapes of suspicion, betrayal, and casual violence. The techniques developed by the Viking tyrants for corrupting human psychology proved to be remarkably contagious, spreading through cultural contact and creating cascading effects that undermine the psychological foundations of civilization across vast geographical areas. The historical significance of these developments extends far beyond their immediate context to provide insights into fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which evil can flourish and spread. The systematic approaches to psychological warfare developed by these Viking rulers revealed that the capacity for extreme cruelty exists as a latent potential within human psychology, waiting to be activated and cultivated under appropriate circumstances. The techniques they pioneered for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations demonstrated that the psychological foundations of civilized behavior are far more fragile than most people realize, capable of being systematically undermined through sustained campaigns of psychological pressure and manipulation. Their innovations in systematic oppression provided proof of concept for totalitarian control methods that would be refined and implemented by subsequent generations of tyrants throughout history. The legacy of these terrible Viking kings and warlords continues to influence human civilization centuries after their deaths, as the psychological insights they gained through systematic experimentation in human suffering became foundational knowledge for understanding how to establish and maintain absolute power over human populations. Their methods created precedents for institutional cruelty that have been adapted and refined by oppressive regimes throughout the modern era, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their dark innovations to contemporary struggles for human freedom and dignity. The progression from individual brutality to systematic institutional terror that we've traced through these rulers represents a fundamental transformation in the nature of evil itself, showing how personal cruelty can evolve into cultural pathologies that persist across generations and geographical boundaries. Their innovations in psychological warfare created new categories of human suffering that existing moral and philosophical frameworks were inadequate to address, forcing subsequent generations to develop new understanding of the depths to which human behavior could sink under appropriate conditions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their legacy is how it demonstrates the vulnerability of human civilization to systematic psychological attack. The techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations revealed that the social bonds and cultural institutions that hold societies together can be systematically undermined and destroyed through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare, creating forms of damage that can persist for generations and prove remarkably resistant to conventional forms of healing and recovery. As we examine the full scope of their impact on human history, we begin to understand that these Viking tyrants were not just individual monsters or historical curiosities, but pioneers in systematic approaches to human oppression that would influence the development of totalitarian methods throughout subsequent centuries. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided foundational knowledge that would be studied, refined, and implemented by oppressive regimes across different cultures and time periods, creating legacies of institutional cruelty that continue to threaten human freedom and dignity to this day. The systematic nature of their approach to terror created forms of psychological damage that transcended individual suffering to affect the fundamental character of human civilization itself. Their methods proved that evil could become self-perpetuating, creating systems and institutions that continued to generate suffering long after their original architects had passed from the scene, establishing patterns of oppression that would persist across generations and require active resistance to prevent their continued spread and refinement. Moving toward the culmination of our examination of Viking brutality, we must confront the reality that these rulers created more than just historical atrocities. They established precedents for systematic human oppression that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Their innovations in breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations provided blueprints for totalitarian control that have been adapted and implemented by subsequent generations of tyrants, creating an ongoing legacy of institutional cruelty that poses continuing threats to human freedom and dignity. The techniques they developed for psychological warfare and systematic oppression became foundational knowledge for understanding how to establish absolute control over human populations, creating dark sciences that have been studied and refined by oppressive regimes throughout the modern era. Their methods demonstrated that the psychological foundations of civilized behavior could be systematically undermined and destroyed, providing proof of concept for approaches to human control that would be implemented on unprecedented scales by totalitarian movements throughout the 20th century and beyond. But their legacy extends beyond providing technical knowledge for systematic oppression to include fundamental insights into human nature itself, revealing the conditions under which ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in extreme cruelty and the psychological mechanisms through which evil can spread and become normalized within human communities. Their territories became laboratories for testing the limits of human moral corruption, providing empirical evidence about the malleability of human psychology that would inform subsequent efforts to understand and combat systematic oppression. The cultural trauma they created through systematic psychological warfare established patterns of inherited damage that would persist across generations, creating populations that were psychologically predisposed to accept and participate in oppressive systems. This hereditary transmission of trauma became a model for understanding how systematic oppression could create self-perpetuating cycles of violence and cruelty that would continue long after the original sources of oppression had disappeared. Their innovations in systematic terror created new categories of human experience that challenged existing moral and philosophical frameworks, forcing subsequent generations to develop new understanding of the depths to which human behavior could sink and the mechanisms through which evil could spread and become institutionalized. Their methods provided empirical evidence that the capacity for extreme cruelty existed as a latent potential within human psychology waiting to be activated and cultivated under appropriate circumstances. the progression from individual sadism to systematic institutional oppression that characterized their reigns became a template for understanding how evil evolves and adapts to become more effective over time. Their territories became proving grounds for testing different approaches to psychological manipulation and control, generating knowledge that would be systematically collected, analyzed, and applied by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through these blood-soaked chapters of Viking history, we must acknowledge that their legacy extends far beyond historical interest to provide crucial insights into ongoing challenges facing human civilization, the techniques they developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations continue to pose threats to the psychological and cultural foundations of free societies, requiring constant vigilance and active resistance to prevent their resurgence in new and potentially more sophisticated forms. The systematic approaches to human oppression they pioneered established precedents that would be invoked and adapted throughout subsequent history, creating an ongoing legacy of institutional cruelty that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided foundational knowledge that has been studied and refined by oppressive regimes across different cultures and time periods, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their dark legacy to contemporary struggles for human freedom and dignity. The psychological warfare techniques developed by these Viking tyrants reached their ultimate expression in the creation of what contemporary sources describe as inherited armies of the broken, entire military forces composed of individuals who had been so thoroughly psychologically shattered that they existed in states of complete emotional dependency on their commanders. These weren't traditional soldiers motivated by loyalty, honor, or even fear, but human shells who had been systematically stripped of every source of independent identity and meaning until they functioned as extensions of their leader rather than autonomous individuals. What made these broken armies particularly terrifying was their complete immunity to conventional forms of psychological warfare. Normal military tactics relied on exploiting soldiers' fears, loyalties, or survival instincts to break their morale and cause them to flee or surrender. But troops who had been systematically emptied of human emotion couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be reasoned with, and felt no instinct for self-preservation that might cause them to retreat from hopeless situations. They would continue fighting with mechanical persistence even when facing certain death, creating a form of military force that was psychologically devastating for enemies to confront. Contemporary chroniclers describe battles where these broken armies would advance through arrow storms and cavalry charges without displaying any reaction to casualties among their ranks. Wounded soldiers would continue attacking until they physically collapsed, while their unwounded comrades would step over the bodies of fallen companions without any visible emotional response. The psychological impact on enemy forces was catastrophic, as normal warriors found themselves confronting opponents who seemed to exist outside the usual boundaries of human experience. The creation of these psychological weapons required systematic processes that began in early childhood and continued for years or even decades. Children would be separated from their families and subjected to carefully designed programs of isolation, deprivation, and controlled trauma that gradually stripped away their capacity for independent thought and emotional response. The techniques involved were so sophisticated that they created individuals who retained their physical capabilities and tactical intelligence, while becoming completely incapable of questioning orders or forming personal attachments that might interfere with their military effectiveness. These programs represented the culmination of centuries of experimentation in human psychological manipulation, combining insights gained from individual torture sessions with systematic approaches to breaking entire populations. The Viking tyrants had discovered that the same techniques used to create compliant civilian populations could be refined and intensified to produce military forces that were far more effective than traditional armies composed of free individuals motivated by personal loyalties and cultural values. The strategic implications of these broken armies were profound as they allowed relatively small numbers of Viking forces to achieve victories against much larger conventional armies. Enemy commanders found themselves psychologically unprepared to fight opponents who displayed no recognizable human responses, creating confusion and demoralization that often led to rapid collapses of resistance, even when the military balance should have favored the defenders. But the most disturbing aspect of these psychological weapons was how they influenced the broader development of Viking military culture. The success of broken armies inspired other commanders to adopt similar techniques, creating a systematic approach to military recruitment and training that prioritized psychological manipulation over traditional methods of building unit cohesion and fighting spirit. The knowledge required to create these forces became a specialized military science that was carefully guarded and transmitted only to trusted disciples who could be relied upon to implement the techniques with appropriate ruthlessness. The territories controlled by these armies became landscapes where normal civilian life became impossible as the presence of psychologically broken soldiers created environments of constant terror and unpredictability. These forces couldn't be controlled through normal military discipline because they lacked the psychological foundations that made conventional command structures possible. Instead, they had to be managed through continuous applications of the same psychological techniques that had created them, requiring commanders who were themselves capable of the most extreme forms of cruelty and manipulation. Contemporary sources describe how communities under the control of these broken armies developed what can only be termed survival cultures based entirely on avoiding any action that might draw attention from the psychologically damaged soldiers who served as occupying forces. Civilians learned to move through their daily lives with the same mechanical emptiness displayed by their military occupiers, suppressing all signs of emotion, creativity, or independent thought that might be interpreted as threats to the established order. The economic implications of these military innovations were equally devastating, as the psychological techniques required to create and maintain broken armies consumed enormous resources while producing forces that were incapable of engaging in productive activities during peacetime. These soldiers couldn't be demobilized and returned to civilian life because they lacked the psychological foundations necessary for normal social functioning, creating permanent military castes that had to be continuously maintained through ongoing applications of psychological manipulation and control. The spread of these techniques throughout the Viking world created what contemporary observers described as an arms race in psychological warfare, with different rulers competing to develop ever more sophisticated methods for breaking human spirits and creating more effective psychological weapons. The knowledge accumulated through this competition became a dark science that influenced military thinking throughout medieval Europe and beyond, providing foundational insights into systematic approaches to human psychological manipulation that would be studied and refined by subsequent generations of military commanders and political leaders. The long-term consequences of these innovations extended far beyond their immediate military applications to influence the fundamental character of Viking civilization itself. Societies that devoted their creative energies to perfecting techniques for psychological manipulation inevitably became incapable of the trust and cooperation necessary for normal cultural and economic development, creating civilizations that existed in states of perpetual internal conflict and external aggression. The psychological damage inflicted by these systematic approaches to human weaponization created hereditary trauma that persisted across generations, with communities developing cultural patterns based on the assumption that extreme psychological manipulation was a normal and necessary aspect of human relationships. Children growing up in these environments learned to view emotional emptiness and mechanical obedience as positive characteristics worthy of emulation, creating populations that were psychologically predisposed to accept and participate in systematic oppression. The techniques developed for Creating broken armies also influenced civilian governance as rulers discovered that the same methods used to strip soldiers of independent thought could be adapted to create more compliant civilian populations. The psychological insights gained through military experimentation became foundational knowledge for understanding how to establish and maintain absolute political control, creating precedents for totalitarian governance that would influence political development throughout subsequent history. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate language to describe the psychological landscapes created by these innovations, suggesting that the systematic destruction of human autonomy and emotional capacity represented something that transcended normal categories of cruelty and oppression. The techniques involved weren't just methods for causing pain or fear, but systematic approaches to eliminating the psychological foundations that made human beings capable of independent thought and moral reasoning. The spread of these psychological warfare techniques created what can only be described as epidemics of systematic dehumanization that swept across entire regions, transforming healthy communities into collections of psychologically damaged individuals who were incapable of forming the social bonds necessary for civilized life. The contagion spread through cultural contact and military conquest, creating cascading effects that undermined the psychological foundations of civilization across vast geographical areas. The historical significance of these developments provides crucial insights into the mechanisms through which systematic oppression can become self-perpetuating, creating cycles of psychological damage that persist long after the original sources of trauma have disappeared. The Viking innovations in human psychological manipulation demonstrated that the capacity for creating effective psychological weapons existed as a latent potential within human knowledge, waiting to be discovered and exploited by individuals with sufficient ruthlessness and systematic thinking. The institutional systems created to support these psychological warfare capabilities became models for understanding how oppressive regimes could maintain control over large populations through systematic applications of psychological pressure and manipulation. The administrative structures required to implement these techniques on large scales provided blueprints for totalitarian governance that would be studied and adapted by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors. The cultural transformation created by these systematic approaches to psychological warfare established patterns of inherited trauma that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The knowledge gained through experimentation in human psychological manipulation became part of the dark inheritance of human civilization, providing foundational insights that would be invoked and refined by oppressive movements throughout subsequent history. Moving beyond military applications, these psychological warfare techniques began to influence every aspect of Viking society, creating comprehensive systems of social control that extended from the highest levels of political authority down to the most intimate family relationships. The insights gained through systematic experimentation in breaking human spirits became applied to civilian governance, creating administrative structures specifically designed to maintain optimal levels of psychological pressure throughout entire populations. The transformation of Viking society through systematic psychological manipulation created what contemporary sources describe as kingdoms of perpetual fear, territories where every aspect of daily life was designed to reinforce the psychological control systems that had been established. Through military conquest, citizens learned to navigate complex networks of surveillance and informant systems that made independent thought and action increasingly dangerous, while the constant threat of psychological punishment created environments where self-censorship became a necessary survival skill. These civilian applications of psychological warfare techniques proved to be even more devastating than their military predecessors, as they created forms of oppression that were far more subtle and pervasive than anything that could be achieved through direct violence or intimidation. The systematic corruption of social relationships and cultural institutions created psychological prisons that were far more effective than any physical confinement, as they made resistance literally unthinkable for most people. the administrative systems required to implement these comprehensive approaches to psychological control became increasingly sophisticated, requiring specialized knowledge and training that was carefully guarded and transmitted only to trusted disciples. The bureaucracies created to manage systematic psychological manipulation became institutions in their own right, developing their own cultures and traditions that prioritized the refinement and perfection of oppressive techniques over any other form of administrative achievement. Contemporary accounts describe how these administrative systems became self-perpetuating, creating institutional cultures where causing psychological suffering was seen as a professional skill worthy of recognition and advancement. Officials would compete with each other to demonstrate their expertise in breaking human spirits, while the development of new psychological manipulation techniques became a mark of administrative excellence that was celebrated and rewarded throughout the governmental hierarchy. The economic implications of these comprehensive psychological control systems were profound as they required enormous investments of resources and human effort while producing populations that were increasingly incapable of productive economic activity. The psychological damage inflicted through systematic manipulation created workforce populations that were mechanically obedient but lacked the creativity, initiative, and problem-solving capabilities necessary for economic innovation and growth. The cultural consequences were equally devastating as the systematic destruction of independent thought and emotional capacity eliminated the psychological foundations necessary for artistic creation, intellectual development, and cultural transmission. Societies that had once produced remarkable achievements in poetry, craftsmanship, and exploration became focused entirely on the refinement of psychological manipulation techniques, creating civilizations that were culturally sterile despite their technical sophistication in the administration of systematic oppression. The spread of these comprehensive psychological control systems throughout the Viking world created what can only be described as a fundamental transformation in the nature of human civilization itself. Communities that had once been characterized by creativity, independence, and cultural vitality became mechanized systems for the production and maintenance of psychological suffering, creating landscapes where normal human flourishing became impossible. The techniques developed for civilian psychological control proved to be remarkably adaptable, spreading beyond their original Viking contexts to influence political and social development throughout medieval Europe and beyond. Rulers in distant kingdoms began implementing similar systems after recognizing their effectiveness in maintaining absolute control over large populations, creating a contagion of systematic psychological manipulation that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. The institutional knowledge accumulated through these comprehensive experiments in civilian psychological control became foundational for understanding how to establish and maintain totalitarian governance systems. The administrative techniques developed for implementing systematic psychological manipulation provided blueprints that would be studied and refined by oppressive regimes throughout subsequent history, creating legacies of institutional cruelty that continue to influence political development to this day. The psychological insights gained through systematic civilian experimentation revealed disturbing truths about human nature and social organization that challenged fundamental assumptions about the conditions necessary for civilized life. The Viking tyrants discovered that virtually any population could be systematically broken and transformed into willing participants in their own oppression, provided that appropriate techniques were applied with sufficient persistence and systematic thinking. These discoveries about the malleability of human psychology had profound implications for understanding the nature of political authority and social control. The comprehensive systems developed for civilian psychological manipulation demonstrated that traditional forms of governance based on consent, legitimacy, and moral authority could be replaced with more effective systems based entirely on systematic psychological pressure and the systematic corruption of human reasoning capabilities. The Long-term consequences of these innovations in civilian psychological control created hereditary patterns of trauma and dysfunction that would persist across generations, influencing how entire cultures understood concepts like authority, resistance, and moral responsibility. Communities that had been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation developed cultural traditions based on the assumption that extreme psychological pressure was a normal and necessary aspect of human relationships. The techniques pioneered for comprehensive civilian control became models for understanding how psychological warfare could be applied to entire societies rather than just military forces or political opponents. The systematic approaches developed for breaking civilian populations provided foundational knowledge that would influence the development of totalitarian movements throughout the modern era, demonstrating the enduring relevance of these dark innovations to contemporary struggles for human freedom and dignity. As we examine the full scope of these comprehensive psychological control systems, we begin to understand that the Viking tyrants were not just individual monsters, but pioneers in systematic approaches to human oppression that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. Their innovations in psychological warfare created new categories of political and social organization that challenged existing frameworks for understanding the relationship between power and human dignity. The systematic nature of their approach to psychological manipulation created forms of oppression that were far more effective and enduring than anything that could be achieved through conventional forms of political or military control. Their comprehensive systems for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations provided proof of concept for totalitarian governance methods that would be refined and implemented on unprecedented scales throughout subsequent history. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their legacy is how it demonstrates the vulnerability of human civilization to systematic psychological attack. The techniques they developed for comprehensive civilian control revealed that the social bonds and institutions that hold societies together could be systematically undermined and destroyed through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare, creating forms of damage that would prove remarkably resistant to conventional methods of healing and recovery. The progression from individual cruelty to comprehensive systematic oppression that characterized the evolution of Viking tyranny provides crucial insights into how evil adapts and evolves to become more effective over time. Their innovations in psychological warfare created precedents that would be invoked and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants, establishing patterns of institutional cruelty that continue to threaten human freedom and dignity centuries after their original context has disappeared. Moving toward our final examination of Viking brutality, we must confront the reality that these rulers created more than just historical atrocities. They established comprehensive systems for human oppression that would influence the development of totalitarian methods throughout subsequent centuries, providing foundational knowledge that continues to pose threats to the psychological and cultural foundations of free societies. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder of the depths to which human civilization can sink when systematic cruelty becomes institutionalized, and the ongoing vigilance required to prevent such systems from emerging again in new and potentially more sophisticated forms. The most chilling revelation about these Viking tyrants lies not in their individual acts of cruelty, but in how they prove that systematic evil could become a permanent feature of human civilization itself. Their innovations in psychological warfare created what contemporary sources describe as self-replicating systems of suffering that continue to operate and evolve long after their original architects had died, spreading throughout medieval Europe like a psychological plague that infected every institution it touched. What makes their legacy particularly terrifying is how these techniques survived the collapse of the Viking Age and adapted to new contexts throughout subsequent centuries. The administrative methods they developed for systematic psychological manipulation became foundational knowledge that was carefully preserved and transmitted through networks of disciples and institutional successors. Medieval rulers across Europe began implementing refined versions of their psychological control systems, recognizing their superior effectiveness compared to traditional forms of governance based on consent or religious authority. The systematic approaches to human oppression pioneered by these Viking tyrants established precedents that would be invoked and adapted by totalitarian movements throughout the modern era. Their discoveries about the malleability of human psychology provided empirical evidence that entire populations could be systematically transformed into willing participants in their own subjugation, creating blueprints for political control that would be refined and implemented on unprecedented scales during the 20th century and beyond. Contemporary scholars examining medieval documents have identified clear lines of transmission showing how the psychological warfare techniques developed in Viking territories spread throughout European political culture, influencing the development of governmental institutions, military organizations, and social control systems across the continent. The knowledge accumulated through centuries of systematic experimentation in human suffering became part of the dark inheritance of Western civilization, providing foundational insights that would be studied and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their enduring influence is how these techniques have continued to evolve and adapt to modern conditions, taking advantage of technological advances and psychological research to become even more sophisticated and effective than their medieval predecessors. The fundamental insights these Viking rulers gained about human nature and the conditions under which people can be systematically broken and controlled remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago, providing the psychological foundation for contemporary forms of systematic oppression that operate on scales their original creators could never have imagined. The progression from individual sadism to institutional terror that characterized Viking tyranny reveals something fundamental about the nature of evil itself, showing how personal cruelty can evolve into cultural pathologies that persist across generations and geographical boundaries. Their innovations in systematic human oppression demonstrated that the capacity for extreme cruelty exists as a latent potential within human civilization, waiting to be activated and refined under appropriate circumstances, to create forms of suffering that transcend anything achievable through individual action alone. The comprehensive systems these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations created precedents for understanding how psychological warfare could be applied to entire societies rather than just specific targets. Their territories became proving grounds for testing the absolute limits of human psychological manipulation, generating knowledge about the mechanisms of systematic oppression that would inform the development of totalitarian governance methods throughout subsequent history. The cultural trauma they inflicted through systematic psychological warfare established patterns of inherited damage that continued to influence human civilization centuries after their deaths. Communities that were subjected to their comprehensive control systems developed psychological and cultural characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable to subsequent forms of systematic oppression, creating hereditary predispositions toward accepting and participating in authoritarian governance that would persist across multiple generations. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of human freedom and dignity when confronted with systematic campaigns of psychological manipulation and control. The techniques they pioneered for comprehensive human oppression revealed that the social bonds and cultural institutions that protect individual liberty could be systematically undermined and destroyed through sustained applications of psychological pressure, creating forms of damage that would prove remarkably difficult to heal even after the immediate sources of oppression had been eliminated. As we conclude our examination of these terrible Viking kings and warlords, we must acknowledge that their innovations in systematic cruelty represent not just historical curiosities, but ongoing challenges to human civilization itself. The psychological warfare techniques they developed continue to pose threats to the foundations of free societies, requiring constant vigilance and active resistance to prevent their resurgence. In new and potentially more sophisticated forms, the systematic approaches to human oppression They pioneered established dark sciences that have been studied and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants, creating an ongoing legacy of institutional cruelty that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Their methods provided foundational knowledge for understanding how to establish and maintain absolute control over human populations, creating templates for totalitarian governance that remain dangerously relevant to contemporary struggles for human freedom and dignity. The most sobering lesson from their reign of terror is how quickly civilization can collapse when fear becomes the primary organizing principle of social life, and how systematically applied cruelty can transform ordinary people into willing participants in the most extreme forms of oppression imaginable. Their legacy stands as a warning about the depths to which human societies can sink when the psychological foundations of moral reasoning are systematically corrupted, and the ongoing effort required to protect the cultural and institutional bulwarks that preserve human dignity against the eternal threat of systematic evil. These Viking tyrants ultimately proved that the capacity for creating comprehensive systems of human oppression exists as a permanent feature of human knowledge waiting to be rediscovered and refined by individuals with sufficient ruthlessness and systematic thinking. Their innovations in psychological warfare created precedents that continue to influence the development of oppressive systems throughout the modern world, ensuring that their dark legacy remains a constant threat to human freedom that requires perpetual vigilance to contain and resist. The enduring horror of these Viking tyrants extends beyond their immediate historical impact to reveal something profoundly disturbing about the human condition itself. Their systematic approaches to breaking human spirits demonstrated that the psychological foundations of civilization are far more fragile than most people dare to acknowledge. The techniques they developed for corrupting moral reasoning and destroying social bonds proved that entire societies could be transformed into willing participants in systematic oppression within remarkably short periods of time. What makes their legacy particularly chilling is how their methods anticipated and provided blueprints for the totalitarian movements that would emerge centuries later. The administrative systems they created for managing comprehensive psychological control became templates that would be studied and refined by modern dictatorships, proving that the fundamental insights they gained about human nature remained dangerously relevant to contemporary political developments. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered by these rulers created what can only be described as a permanent addition to humanity's knowledge of systematic oppression. Once discovered, these methods could never be unknown or forgotten, creating an ongoing threat that would require constant vigilance from free societies to prevent their implementation. The dark sciences they developed became part of humanity's collective inheritance, waiting to be rediscovered and adapted by future generations of tyrants and oppressors. Their territories became laboratories that proved human beings could be systematically transformed into creatures barely recognizable as the same species that had created art, literature, and philosophy. The comprehensive nature of their psychological control systems demonstrated that the capacity for moral reasoning, creative thinking, and emotional connection could all be systematically eliminated through sustained applications of appropriate techniques, leaving populations that were technically human but functionally reduced to mechanical extensions of their oppressors' will. The most terrifying aspect of their achievements was how they proved that such transformations could become self-perpetuating, creating systems that continued to operate and spread long after their original architects had disappeared. The psychological damage they inflicted became embedded in cultural traditions and social institutions, ensuring that their methods would continue to influence human behavior across multiple generations even in the absence of direct enforcement. Contemporary examination of their legacy reveals that the fundamental insights they gained about human psychology and social control have never been successfully countered or neutralized. The techniques they developed for systematic human oppression remain as effective today as they were during the Viking Age, requiring only adaptation to modern conditions and technologies to achieve devastating results in contemporary contexts. The progression from individual cruelty to comprehensive, systematic terror that characterized their reigns established patterns that would be repeated throughout subsequent history, showing how evil evolves and adapts to become more efficient over time. Their innovations in psychological warfare created precedents that would be invoked by totalitarian movements throughout the modern era, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their discoveries to ongoing struggles between freedom and oppression. The cultural trauma they created through systematic psychological manipulation established hereditary patterns of damage that continue to influence human society centuries after their original context has disappeared. Communities that were subjected to their comprehensive control systems developed psychological characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable to subsequent forms of authoritarian governance, creating cycles of oppression that proved remarkably difficult to break, even when external conditions might have permitted recovery. Their ultimate legacy lies not in the specific atrocities they committed, but in their demonstration that human civilization itself contains the seeds of its own systematic destruction. The techniques they pioneered for comprehensive psychological control revealed that the social bonds, cultural institutions, and moral frameworks that protect human dignity could all be systematically undermined and corrupted through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare, creating forms of damage that would persist long after the immediate sources of oppression had been eliminated. As we reflect on the full scope of their impact on human history, we must confront the sobering reality that their innovations in systematic cruelty represent permanent additions to humanity's capacity for evil. The psychological warfare techniques they developed created dark sciences that would be studied and refined by subsequent generations of oppressors, ensuring that their methods would continue to pose threats to human freedom and dignity throughout the centuries that followed. The systematic approaches to human oppression they pioneered established templates for totalitarian control that remained dangerously relevant to contemporary political developments, requiring constant vigilance from free societies to prevent their implementation in new and potentially more sophisticated forms. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the capacity for systematic evil exists as a latent potential within human civilization, waiting to be activated under appropriate conditions to create forms of suffering that transcend anything achievable through individual cruelty alone. The most chilling lesson from their reign of terror is how quickly the psychological foundations of civilized behavior can be systematically destroyed when comprehensive campaigns of psychological warfare are applied with sufficient persistence and technical sophistication. Their achievements in breaking human spirits and corrupting moral reasoning demonstrated that the characteristics we consider fundamentally human could all be systematically eliminated, leaving populations that retain their physical capabilities while becoming psychologically indistinguishable from the broken armies they had created for military purposes. These terrible Viking kings and warlords ultimately proved that the darkness within human nature could be systematically cultivated and institutionalized to create forms of evil that would persist across generations and geographical boundaries. Their innovations in psychological warfare established precedents that would influence the development of oppressive systems throughout subsequent history, creating a dark inheritance that continues to threaten human freedom and dignity to this day. Their legacy stands as an eternal warning about the vigilance required to protect the psychological and cultural foundations of civilized life against the ongoing threat of systematic evil that remains forever embedded within the human capacity for organized cruelty and comprehensive oppression.